The conflicts in Ukraine and in Gaza are currently dominating the world stage. But the conflict data and crisis mapping done by ACLED shows that an overwhelming number of conflicts less in the spotlight are causing widespread geopolitical unrest. They are a testimony to the increasing violence against civilian populations around the world. The Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, or SDC, operates in various priority regions around the world through its international cooperation. But how does international cooperation contribute to sustainable peace?
Switzerland remains present in many conflict regions and pursues a comprehensive approach to peace building. With its long-term engagements and field presence, Switzerland has established a strong basis of trust which contributes to peace-building activities at the highest political level. Together with local and global partners, the SDC conducts more than 100 programs and contributes around 100 million Swiss francs per year to peace-building activities.
In South Sudan, for example, by providing safe spaces to protect women and other marginalized groups against violence, by supporting community peace structures to influence decision-making and increasing social cohesion.
In Mali, by strengthening local authorities and communities in inclusive governance, social mediation and conflict prevention, and by providing training for women to become peace builders and to engage in conflict management and mediation at local and national levels. This empowers them to improve access to basic services in besieged towns.
In Nepal, by supporting the peace process and addressing harmful social norms, by assisting victims of gender-based violence, and by strengthening federalism and inclusive economic development to address the root causes of the conflict. All this improves people's well-being, increases safety, and in the end, reduces the risk of violence.
Another very important way to contribute to sustainable peace is through water. In Switzerland, so far, we don't have to worry about enough drinking water or water for farming and industry. But people in other parts of the world are facing water stress, and that can trigger violent conflicts.
The number of such water-related violent incidents is clearly on the rise. Unfortunately, in armed conflicts, water resources and infrastructure can be used as a target or even become a weapon. Everywhere, water systems are crucial to environmental and human well-being. No matter if specifically targeted or unintentionally damaged during a conflict, any disruption of water systems often means cutting the lifeline of local people.
Water diplomacy is a catalyst for peace. Switzerland's Blue Peace Initiative is an important contribution to peace. It aims to make transboundary water management more sustainable by ensuring a fair and equitable distribution of water among all. The Middle East is not only one of the most water-scarce regions in the world, it is also facing the detrimental impacts of climate change, which exacerbates water stress. Blue Peace wants to avoid disputes over shared river basins, common groundwater bodies, or access to clean water to reduce the risk of water-induced conflicts. The Blue Peace Middle East program aims at using water as an instrument to build up and secure peace in the region. By promoting trust and facilitating the dialogue between countries that share rivers such as the Tigris, Euphrates, or Yarmouk.
With its long-standing experience in the region and diplomatic expertise, SDC's Blue Peace program is an important approach to promoting transboundary water cooperation at all levels. However, joint agreements on shared water resources are highly political and complex. They take time to develop. But once mutually signed, these agreements pave the way to a sustainable use and management of water at all levels. They bring people together to seek fair and equitable solutions, thereby reducing tensions and possibly avoiding violent conflicts.
Let's therefore join hands to identify and implement innovative regional solutions to address global challenges such as a water-secure world. Because only together we can ensure water for future generations and cope with climate change.
Young people from all over the world are already setting a positive example. Let us follow their example together and get inspired for different solutions.
Hello, and welcome to this session on water and peace, managing transboundary water and promote water in a secure world. My name is Guillaume Charon. I'm the Director of Independent Diplomat in Geneva, and I will be moderating this session today. Today, as you have seen, water-related conflicts are on the rise. Water management is ever crucial crucial for prosperity and our peace. New transboundary agreements between countries and communities are emerging. What are they? Are they effective? Are they replicable? To discuss this today, we'll have the pleasure of having with us President Dr. Danilo Turk. We will have with us Dr. Seema Samar from Afghanistan. Dr. Danilo Turk is from Columbia University. He is the former chair of the Global High-Level Panel on Water and Peace and the former president of Slovenia. And Dr. Seema Samar is now a member of the United Nations Secretary General High-Level Panel on Internal Displacement and was the Minister for Human Rights and International Affairs of Afghanistan. We'll also have with us Mrs. Miriam Haritz, who is the president of the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine Waters, and she also had the director of Water Environment at the Ministry of Environment in the German Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Environment of Germany. We'll also have with us Julian Schillinger, who is the representative of the Youth Parliament for Water and is a PhD candidate in the Netherlands on water. I would like to welcome on the stage Dr. Turk and Dr. Samar. Thank you. Thank you.
Sit here?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you.
So if you don't mind, Dr. Turk, I will start with Dr. Samar.
Sure.
They say ladies first. So if you could tell me what this movie inspired you in 3 words.
In 3 words. First of all, thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to be in this panel. 1 word, access to water is a basic human right. I think the 3 words is coming here.
Yes, thank you. And I will replicate Dr. Turk. If you have few words that the movie inspired in you.
Well, water cooperation is historically tested as a way of strengthening cooperation, stabilizing peace, and in times of conflict, overcoming armed conflict and building peace from below. So I think that film shows that quite well. It is focused on the contemporary situations, but it builds on vast historic experience which has consistently shown the importance of water management and water cooperation for social stability, for peace, and in case of overcoming conflict, for peace building and post-conflict stabilization.
Right. Yes, I think the movie demonstrates that, and it's powerful, but at the same time, I can only think of, the naysayers, and if I can start with that, if you don't mind. Dr. Turk, there are written traces of water and conflict from the days of Mesopotamia. I think as early as written, people have taken records of conflict. We've seen it in Europe during the medieval war, where people were poisoning wells and sieges. As well as the movie also made me think of Boutros Ghali, the former Secretary General of the UN, who told us in the 90s that wars would be fought over would be fought over water rather than politics in the future. And I think the movie also demonstrated this increased number of wars. My question is, have we learned anything from these past experiences?
I think yes. Well, perhaps I should say, currently I'm working as a political advisor to the Geneva Water Hub. Geneva Water Hub is an organization, a center of competence dealing with various aspects of water for peace activities, from peace building, diplomacy at the United Nations, also capacity building, analysis, research, and so forth. So we have produced that report on water and peace back in 2017. And why I'm mentioning this now as a part of my response to your question, I would say we have learned that some of the expectations of the past were not really did not materialize the way that were formulated in the past. So you quoted Boutros Ghali. Of course, water is not the major cause of conflict. Water in contemporary conflicts is more a victim of armed force than anything else. So the emphasis today has to be on preventing or stopping weaponization of water in existing armed conflict. Those conflicts emerge for various reasons, and water is a victim. And through water, civilian populations are a victim, and therefore the international community has to be aware of that and should mobilize in a kind of a coalition, an alliance against weaponization of water. That's an important priority today. Now, this has nothing. There is no reason why we would not study previous understandings and previous experience. But we have to know that today things are moving in a direction which was not entirely envisaged and requires new responses. And that's what we are trying to do.
Right. No, I think that's a very, very powerful point to put the weaponization of water and seeing water as a victim. I think, I couldn't help but think of Afghanistan, Dr. Samar, because Afghanistan has often been seen in the Western psychic as, a country that has been a victim of that, an arid country with conflicts and so on. But it's also a country that's at the foothill of the Pamir and Himalayan mountains. The communities have managed water there for millennia. And in many ways, one could ask, what powerful stories does Afghanistan has to tell us on the complex relationship between the community's management of water and the complexities of conflict brought upon them?
Yes, I think water, as we all know, is vital for life.
Right.
Besides that, it's a basic human rights. Access to water is a basic human right. But in Afghanistan, actually, we have been 45 years in conflict, and actually conflict reduce people's access to water for a few reasons. One, I think the forests that we had before, for the forest for pine trees and also forest of pistachios or other forests that we had, was cut off by people, opposition to the government and the pro-Russian, and by the pro-Russian mainly, by the Russian soldiers also, because people were using those forests in jungles to hide and fight against the government.
Right.
So one reason, unfortunately, one reason of the conflict in Afghanistan. The second is that we have, of course, limited amount of land. And of course, the water, it's very mountainous areas. The water is always in the valleys. In the valley, the agricultural land is not a lot. And During the Russian invasion, they actually destroyed the water points also in order to push or pressure the people, because they destroyed the villages and also the water points.
Right.
And they destroyed the livestock of the people. So that is what always I call on accountability for all these, because it's a war, crimes and crimes against humanity. And we see that the water become politicized in Afghanistan also, because it's not only the water within Afghanistan has a problem, because the piece of land and the Afrinitini group, and unfortunately the conflict divide people more. I mean, it only not destroying the physical structure, but also destroying the people's behavior, the people's connectivity. So that is one of the problems that that the issue increased, the tension between different ethnic groups. Currently, for example, the Taliban pushed the Hazaras out of those areas where there's water and take their land back because of not enough places. That the other issue that I think conflict really facilitate the drought in Afghanistan is also the use of so many bombs. To give you an example, the mother bomb that was dropped during Trump administration in one of the village, it's really burned a lot of greenery in the country.
Right.
So that the area is not possible to live, let alone all those rays and also all those chemicals that used in the bombs, and contamination of water and everything in the area. So it is also problematic. The third point, I think, due to conflict, nobody really paid attention on management of water in Afghanistan. Because yes, we don't have a lot of water. With the climate change, we used to have 1 meters of snow all the time. And it was in some point of the country, we had snow from one winter to another winter. I mean, it was still snow, which was the reason for the water in the river and some streams, and also the way we are using it. But that is not the case anymore. Like last winter, we didn't have enough snow. It's very scary that what has happened. The fourth point, during this conflict, actually, nobody paid attention to family planning, to control of population. Higher population requires more water. Clear. There's no, this doesn't require a PhD or high-level education. It is simple calculation.
Right.
Which is unfortunate, actually, in Afghanistan. The other problem in Afghanistan is that because some of our river water goes to the neighboring countries, like partially it goes to Pakistan, Kunar and Kabul River, which is dry currently, but still there are some water from Afghanistan goes to Pakistan, and also the south part, it goes to southwest, goes to Iran. And that is causing conflict. Because whenever the Afghan government wants to build a dam or anything, it is the intervention of the neighboring countries. And I keep saying that we have to acknowledge this problem that exists and find a solution, rather than being very destructive and violent against each other.
Right.
So that is also unfortunately facilitating the conflict and a source of conflict. With Iran, for example, in some of one of the provinces in Afghanistan, like in Nimroz area, in some places, water is more expensive than the oil.
Yes.
Because the water that we have, it's very salty, and people can't use it. So for drinking water, the gallon of water is more expensive than the gallon of of oil or gas.
Right. Well, I think this is a reality check for most of us living in the West, that actually in many countries of the world, the price of oil, drinkable water, is higher than oil. I see this also in many Middle Eastern countries where oil is subsidized as well, and so on. But on this issue of transboundary, I mean, this is something that you, Dr. Turk, at the Water Hub have been following. What does this inspire?
Well, look, the fundamental fact is that water is life. Oil is not life, but water is life. So one has to go back to the fundamental importance of water and then use knowledge from before and models that have been tested in practice to see how water could serve people. Now, we have a lot of different experiences, but one of them is particularly important, and that is the experience of Senegal River Cooperation, which binds several states in the region, Senegal, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, and that form that was established some half a century ago almost was done with a vision. You know, water is fundamental for all of them and should be made an area or a subject of cooperation which will help, and which will help in a variety of ways, in agriculture, improving livelihood, energy generation, but also political stability. And all that has worked pretty well. Now, that is one of the more recent examples which need to be quoted on every occasion, because it shows that with a necessary political vision, one can develop a model of transboundary cooperation which really is something basic, which brings back the essential fact that water is life. Now, life is a complex matter, and in the case that I use as an example, it of course has all these dimensions, from agriculture to political stability. And I think that that inspiring model should be used in a variety of circumstances today. I myself, I hope that at one point we'll come to a situation in the Middle East where it would be possible to develop a regional mechanism binding together a number of countries of the region. I don't want to go into details at this point, and of course there are many difficulties involved, many dramatic difficulties really. But I think that the fundamental message of historical experience is such that it should give us enough energy to continue everywhere where we go. In the part of Europe where I live, of course, historical experience is important. One of the more recent examples is that after the disintegration of former Yugoslavia, one of the first mechanisms of cooperation which brought together majority of successor states was water. Was the Sava River Cooperation Agreement, which was negotiated immediately after the war in Bosnia, and it works perfectly today. It protects areas around the river from floods. It provides better cooperation on energy generation, and it's an important factor of stability. Now, that's an example which is more typical for an area where I come from, but it comes from the very basic fact: water is life, and life is complex, and water should be approached with that complexity in mind, and a variety of cooperative mechanisms have to be developed.
Right. I mean, water is a very basic fundamental right, as you were saying, Dr. Samar. But you mentioned also that obviously it's almost like a tool for regional cooperation. So I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome with us Mrs. Miriam Harritz and Julian Schillinger to join our panel. Please. Thank you. And let me start with you, since we're talking about regional cooperation. At the end of the day, you're leading the Rhine Environmental Commission. So, I mean, the Rhine Convention must feel like to quote a French movie, a long, tranquil river by comparison to many of other areas of the country. And maybe this is a misperception that you can actually dispel here. But, actually the movie starts with an explosion and a bang. So, it could also be a metaphor for the challenges and the difficulty that comes with regional cooperation. But probably you can tell us what is necessary to keep, that water flowing and that cooperation going, because the challenge is also maintaining the sustainability of that cooperation, I suppose, right?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And if I'm allowed, I would like to tell a little bit about the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine, its history, how we got where we are today.
Yes.
So exactly 25 years ago to this day, on 12th of April 1999, Switzerland, Germany, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands and the European Union signed the new Rhine Convention in nearby Bern. But the International Commission for the Protection of the Rhine, as such, in short, ICPR, is much older. We will be celebrating our 75th anniversary next year. So on the Rhine, there are basically two of the oldest river commissions on transboundary cooperation on the Rhine River in the world. One is the Central Commission for the Navigation of the Rhine, which was founded after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and was focused on duty-free navigation. And then on 11th July 1950, in nearby Bern again, it was actually that the ICPR as such was founded. Already in the previous years, just right after the Second World War, it was the Netherlands that had tried to address the pollution of the Rhine River. First within the existing commissions, one of them being the Samen Conference here in Basel. But both bodies declared themselves not responsible for pollution matters, but the idea of setting up a new commission was born right here in Basel. So as I said before, it was shortly after World War II ended. I'm not sure if we're able to show the pictures because I have a picture of what Cologne looked like just right after the end of the World War. And I think it is very remarkable that countries that had fought each other so fiercely managed to cooperate again so quickly. Keep in mind that not only Cologne looked like that, but the Netherlands were occupied by Germany in the 1940s, and the Germans caused vast destruction in Rhine cities like Rotterdam. But it was the Netherlands that took the initiative to come together with precisely Germany amongst others. There was certainly some pragmatism in it, as being the last country downstream, they suffered the most from pollution accumulated through the river of 1,200 kilometers length. And they couldn't solve the problem on their own. But still, I believe that the early beginnings of the ICPR clearly reflect the power of water to peacefully bring together former enemies. Today, the Rhine River is clear again. Biodiversity has increased, 70 native fish species are back, among them the Atlantic salmon. The population is seeking the proximity of the river. In cities like Basel or Cologne, you will find them picnicking next to the river, which would be my next picture, taken from Cologne, which is where I live, but it could be like that in Basel as well. So overall, 60 million people peacefully rely on the Rhine for drinking water, as an important economic waterway, for energy and cooling water and industry, as a tourist destination, and an important ecological lifeline. This is not saying that this success was an easy thing to achieve or to maintain. And there have been setbacks, like, for instance, the fire in an industrial area near Basel in 1986, the Sandoz accident, leading to a large fish kill. But the countries even saw that as a wake-up call and intensified their efforts even more. Transboundary cooperation was also strengthened with the introduction of river basin-related water directives at EU level, a vice versa effect on the Rhine within the Commission. So today, the Rhine countries are confronted with ever new challenges: micropollutants, dams that still have no fish passes, climate change with either floods or low water levels and rising water temperatures. These are just a few examples. But the Rhine countries nowadays have a functioning cooperation mechanism they can always fall back on. So what is their recipe for success? First, a common vision and common goals like set up in our current Rhine program called Rhine 2040. Second, looking at the responsibility of the national states. It is up to them to take measures to achieve these goals. Our Commission, as such, contributes by facilitating an interplay between technical expertise and strategic level cooperative decision-making. And third, also very important, and a role model to other countries, including a strong civil society. We cooperate with 20 NGOs that take part in the activities of our Commission. So as we've heard before, the ICPR is not the only transboundary river basin commission. You will find such commissions in almost every important international river basin in Europe. The Secretaries General meet regularly, and one example is our youngest river commission, the Sava River Basin Commission, which brought indeed together former war opponents 10 years after the end of the Balkan Wars. And similarly, the most international river commission in Europe is the one on the Danube River. It's in existence for the past 30 years, and it helped to bring a large number of states together after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Thus, I do believe that transboundary river commissions like the ICPR serve as best practice examples on how to establish and safeguard peace through water across borders. Thank you, and I hope that does in part answer your question addressed to me.
No, it does. Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting to see how water can also be a tool for reconciliation, actually, and the historical background was very useful in that. Just for the crowd, I'll draw your attention that questions are starting to come up, so I invite you to also go on Slido and contribute and vote for questions as well as provide new ones. But before I go to the questions, I would like to give Julian an opportunity to also contribute to our discussions. I mean, faced with all those challenges, you represent the voice of the youth in many ways. But it feels also like, you know, a lot of those agreements and all of that are about preserving a world which is portrayed as equitable. But with climate change and the environmental challenges that we have, challenging the system could be portrayed as inequitable, but at the same time, that's what you need to do. Maybe you can talk about, you know, the youth perspective on this.
Certainly, thank you, Guillaume. And it actually goes back a little bit to Dr. Türk, what you told us already about rethinking and reframing some of what we're currently seeing in the world. Do we still need to think about the same things that we first thought about or that previous generations thought about 20, 30, 40 years ago? Or has the world changed to such an extent that we need to change how we approach it as well? And similarly, to Dr. Haritz, I want to start with a photo and a bit of a story. If you can get it up, I will show you a photo that I took back in 2019. Here we go, yes, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. This was in the context of a civil society-led water forum on Mesopotamia, bringing together different civil society organizations, researchers, both from the region and from abroad, including from Europe, to the region to really see what is happening along the Euphrates, along the Tigris. And so this was actually along one of the tributaries of the Tigris, the Lesser Zab, which comes from Iran, from the mountains, into the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and then flows further down to the Tigris. And the day we went to the Dukhan Dam, which is one of the largest dams in Iraq, the entire area was flooded. And so what happened was that the region had a particularly wet winter. And by the time we got there in April, there was so much water coming from upstream, from Iran, that the dam actually got to its maximum. This was the second time in its history this ever happened. This is a dam from the 70s. So it was once in the 80s, and it was one exactly the day we were there. And so for the first time ever, they had to open their own emergency spillways in coordination, of course, then downstream with the central government of Iraq, because all of the water would sooner or later go towards the Tigris. And so we went there as water managers, as experts very interested in these transboundary dynamics. We talked to a couple of people at the dam, we talked to different water managers from the region, and then we tried to get back. And we encountered our road flooded because there was too much water coming from the dam. And so you had all of the professionals standing there, taking notes, looking very, very interested. Oh, what is happening here? What is happening? And then you had the kids. The kids were just running around playing in the water because it was awesome. For them, this was the best day of the year. They get to run around in this river that normally they're not allowed to go into because it's too big, because their parents don't want them to get too wet. So for them, this was a great experience. And what we saw was that these kids, no matter where they came from, they were immediately connecting over this shared experience of, hey, we actually get to engage with our water. We actually get to have fun here. And being able to connect on this very, very human level, I think, is something that is so important as we're talking about peace, as we're talking about trust building, as we had in the panel this morning. And I think it's something that sometimes sitting in our boardrooms and sitting in all of these very formal processes, we forget about. And so for me, that is one of the strengths that young people can bring in. Just a bit of fresh air, maybe a bit of fresh water. This goes together with another discussion we already had this morning, which is technology. We spend a lot of time on our phones, on the internet, maybe too much time. Maybe we should go outside a little bit more often. But the power of this technology we have right now is connection. We are more connected with people around the world than we were ever before. And we now have several generations of young people who have been growing up with this, who have fostered a sense of just very casual cultural exchange through the internet. And this is built in our psyche now. It is a kind of empathy for other cultures that was a lot harder to cultivate in earlier generations. And I think that is something we can really capitalize on as we discuss how are we sharing natural resources, how are we building peace, how do we want to live together. And so I think this perspective is very, very important to bring into the discussion from this youth perspective.
Right, thank you. I think it's a very powerful point. I mean, some of the main words that came around what inspired the movie was around life. And I think the experience of water, of sharing water, that you're underlying is something very duly noted. Then that goes back, I want to go back to you on this. People and countries share water together. How can we foster peace around that? I see one of the questions that's already here, the third one on engaging upstream with countries that are reluctant, but it goes the other way around as well. Like you can have very powerful downstream countries that are menacing the others, and so how do you share that? How do you make sure that works?
Look, I'll come to this, but I see also that as a question of humanitarian law, which I would like to say a few words before I come to directly answering your question, and perhaps we could take advantage of some pictures that we had from some of the recent conflicts. I don't know if they are available now. You see, this is, I think, from Gaza, destroyed water infrastructure. There was another one from Vukovar in Croatia, destroyed water infrastructure in that war at that time. And what I think this tells us that we have to understand that in contemporary armed conflicts, water infrastructure is particularly targeted and has to be protected. Now, the humanitarian law, as it evolved after World War II through Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, does have some basic provisions for protection of infrastructure, but they are not very detailed and they are not seen as the priority concern of those conventions. So there is a need for additional focused attention and action at the diplomatic level, through the media, in education, everywhere. And that is why these things have to be given a very strong priority today. If we want to be serious about implementation of humanitarian law, we have to define with great precision where are the new and most damaging violations of that law and where the action against those violations has to take place. And that's why I think sparing of water, protection of water infrastructure, and making sure that reverberating effects of those attacks on water infrastructures do not take place, or that they are at least limited. We also have to understand that waterborne diseases, which come as a result of destroyed water infrastructure, produce huge effects on civilian populations. Now, Geneva Water Hub has been recently involved in some of the analytical work on Gaza. There are 300,000 cases of severe diarrhea already in Gaza today, affecting mainly children. Now, if that goes on, if there is no action against this sort of process which is now taking place as a result of destroyed infrastructure, we would have cholera and we would have terrible health situation affecting huge number of civilians. So we have to understand that, and I think that if we talk about humanitarian law, we must be really very focused and make sure that that pressure is organized as effectively as possible. So that was the first question, and I wanted to refer to that. But on the second question, on the downstream-upstream relations, look, here we have certain guidance in international water law, which requires, in case of transboundary waters, that water resources are used equitably and effectively, and that no unnecessary, harm is made in the process of using of those resources. What you see when the upstream and downstream countries talk, the upstream countries would say, yes, reasonable, effective use, and downstream countries will say, well, but no significant harm. So, you have to apply both principles. How do you do that? In Central Asia, which is mentioned here, I think there is a great need for an appropriate regional political framework which would produce a basis for such cooperation. I know that political leaders in the region are now more inclined to provide such a framework than was the case earlier. I'm talking about countries north of Afghanistan. I'm not including Afghanistan into that because unfortunately that is not possible right now. But the political will is emerging. The political will usually doesn't come out of thin air. Political will has to be generated. And the task, I think, for activists like all of us in this room is to help generating that political will, saying, all right, we have the basic framework in the international water law, but upstream, downstream countries have to combine both principles, effective and reasonable use, as well as preventing significant harm. Now, of course, that can then be translated in more specific rules and institutions for such cooperation do matter, and we know that. I mean, from Rhine Commission, from Danube Commission, Senegal River Commission, and all other institutions. So there is a way forward. There is a way forward, but obviously nothing happens without hard work.
Right. No, nothing happens without hard work, but I think nothing happens also without goodwill and, as the plenary highlighted, trust. I think goodwill is key. I mean, I cannot help but think that currently there is discussions or negotiations, hard-fought negotiations between Egypt and Ethiopia, for instance, on the Nile, right? And then Egypt is still using agreements on the usage of the waters of the Nile from the 1929.
Yeah.
So that's a colonial heritage. I say this because that was one of the questions. How can you genuinely use international agreements that are dated to that point?
Yeah, well, look, in this particular case, there is clearly a need for a new agreement. Now, that new agreement will not come automatically. We understand that. And what we now see on the Nile, and what I find really very interesting, is a kind of a political management of the process which gradually recognizes a new relationship between Ethiopia and Egypt. Earlier on, there was a time when Egypt was issuing threats against Ethiopia, and there was a time when Ethiopia was saying that, well, they don't really take into account any sort of threat and so forth. So there the language of communication was much more conflictual in the past. We now see that the language in that communication is less conflictual, and my optimistic conclusion, I hope not naive conclusion, would be that the most affected countries in the region, which are not only Egypt and Ethiopia, but also both Sudans and all that, are gradually absorbing the reality of new relations that are emerging in the region, which would, I believe, eventually lead to a new agreement. The situation is not yet ripe for that, but it will come. And also in the filling of the reservoirs of the Grand Renaissance dams, we have seen that there hasn't been any major disaster for downstream countries. No? There have been some anxiety, there were legitimate worries about this, but there was no disaster. And that's not insignificant, because it creates an environment, it creates conditions within which a search for a new and better agreement is possible, and I believe it will happen. That's my take. You asked me and I answered.
No, but I mean, it's been a question that's been coming because of many of these agreements being dated, you know,
Sure.
And having a colonial heritage. And one may also ask, we had that conversation, Julian, I mean, how participatory those agreements were when they were done in 1929, and Sudan hardly, it was a condominium with, between Egypt and the United Kingdom back then. And I think the participatory approach is something that you, Sima, have experienced in Afghanistan as not just Minister of International Affairs, but also human rights. And water is a human rights. I don't know how much that dimension plays in the transboundary discussions between countries in your experience.
Before answering your question, I think I just wanted to also have a comment on the international humanitarian law. I fully agree that the international humanitarian law does not reflect a lot of issues that we have today. Yeah. But even if that international humanitarian law is applied, we will have less impunity and less killing and less damaging the way, I mean, the water is used in Gaza, for example. That is one issue. The other issue that I want to mention here is that the impact of water supplies on women, particularly, is really very high, because it causes more work for women. They are the ones who collect the water. In some areas, like in India and Afghanistan also, they have to walk hours in order to get the water for the family. And it is a violation of human rights. And we don't really look to the water issues and commissions of the water should be gender sensitized somehow in order to look at that issue as well. I think in Afghanistan, I have to mention that I was the chairperson of Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission for so long. When my term was over, the president put me on that nominal Minister of State for International Affairs. It was not materialized at all. He wanted me to be in his team during the election, which I didn't want to be on his team. So that is to clarify my position in Afghanistan.
Point taken.
Yeah, I think it's sad because, as I said, the conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the conflict between Iran and Afghanistan, and we always use the blame game rather than coming to sit and solve it. We so-called upstream, or the resource of the water, and then it goes to those countries. And we claim it's our water, which is not enough for Afghanistan, let alone to give it to the neighboring country. But I think if there's a strong political will, they can find a solution, and they should find a solution. The other issue, which is very, very scary in Afghanistan, is that the groundwater is level is going really deep. Just to mention my own personal house, we had a well in the house which was 50 meters, completely dried. Currently in the neighboring houses, in my own house, 110 meters. In some of the desert, actually because there were no rule of law, that's why I insist on rule of law for everyone. The smugglers actually encourage people to dig a well and then to grow opium. Right. And they did. And that the reduction of underground water in Afghanistan is scary. I don't know what will happen. I don't know that part. I mean, that's not my profession. But it might cause another disaster in Afghanistan. So I think that those are the issues that should be discussed in every country, because it's not one, the problem is not staying in that country. Right. Reach in one way or another to everyone. Thank you.
No, you're welcome. But I mean, I think there are many challenges that are coming on top of the existing ones.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think this is a reality you're probably facing. I mean, in the Rhine Commission, I mean, there were some criticism about how it was insufficiently stringent on environmental challenges. Plus, on top of that, we have climate change, which is coming and adding a layer of complexity in cooperation, but also, I mean, norms might be completely outdated to the reality that were organized, agreed to before that additional challenges. Is this a reality that you face, and how do you see the adaptation of the normative frameworks that you operate under?
Yeah, in a way that is, of course, a reality. Times change, and so we have to adapt accordingly. And this is why our different programs targeted at around 20 years, we had Rhine 2020, now we have Rhine 2040, have a separate focus. Now, if you'd asked me like 10 years ago, then concerning the consequences of climate change, we would have focused more on flood events and high water. Whereas now, after summers like 2022, which was very dry, we had problems with low water, then the focus will be an additional one. I wouldn't say a different one, just to take one example out of the consequences of climate change. But I think generally, and that also comes back to some of the questions which have been asked about the relationship between downstream and upstream countries, I think that's from my experience within the Commission, but it's also a claim to everybody dealing in water policies. We need to get out of silo thinking. Everybody benefits from a healthy and sustainably cared for river. So you can't just pretend like if Switzerland dumps everything into the river and that would only be a problem for the Netherlands. That's not the case. A river is a living body. You can't just cut it into sections following national bodies. So when I look back at the history of the ICPR, how did the former war enemies come together? Well, I think in the beginning they might have even thought, I don't like you, but still we have a joint interest, so we have to cooperate. Because if the river in my section is going to be healthier, because back then it was mostly about ecology, then everybody will benefit from it. And even when you look within regions in member states, like the largest portion of the Rhine River is in Germany, you will have conflict of interests there as well. I work for the Ministry of the Environment, but we would be naive to consider the Rhine River just a purely aquatic ecosphere and not have in mind that there are also interests in terms of being also a waterway. So of course, even within Germany, we have on the federal level, but also on the regional level, discussions about navigation versus fish fauna and flora, for instance. So get out of silo thinking, and you will always have conflicting interests, but that doesn't mean that you can't get, in many aspects, to a win-win situation for everybody. And I think that's what river commissions in the end stand for.
Right. So it's about goodwill. It's
not just goodwill, it's pure self-interest as well. It's like if everybody wins, then you will be winning as well.
Right.
So you're not being altruistic by giving something as an upstream country to a downward country, but that thinking needs to be there, not just looking within your national or regional borders, but to understand, and this is also why in the beginning the Commission focused on the Rhine as an ecosystem to better its quality, but that has had a positive effect on the use in all other areas as well. Even in the industrial sector, it would be very short-sighted to just look at that side of a policy field.
Right. But then that requires, I mean, when I'm thinking of climate change, I also think about how, in many ways, our current uses and practices are actually colonizing the future in many ways. And with youth, I can only think of that. So in many ways, there's this extra dimension of a reality that hasn't happened, which is why I was thinking of goodwill. How do you catalyze youth in all of this and factor it in, especially when it's not a reality of the present? It's something that you've got to factor in, you know?
I think there's a couple levels to this, or a couple of different dimensions. The first part, indeed, it is our future as a sense. I'm not the youngest myself anymore either. But, you know, there's a lot of generations coming up who feel very, very deeply about the fact that our future is in trouble. We see it in the youth climate movement, we see it at biodiversity COPs, we see it all over the place in a lot of very, very strong environmental advocacy and activism. But at the same time, I think we also need to think about young people, not just in terms of these activists. We need to think about young people in terms of young professionals. These are upcoming experts. We take definitions of youth up to, like, for example, 30 years old.
Right.
By that time, you have a master, you've already worked for several years. I'm about to finish my PhD, finally. So, you know, we are also experts. And I think that is a point that we need to take into consideration to say, okay, how can we actually leverage these fresh, young experts? The second part that comes to it is that you have a lot of young people who are already incredibly active in their communities. And I think one element that we don't necessarily forget, but we tend to not talk about as much in these discussions on water and peace, is that, of course, we have transboundary cooperation between different countries. But a lot of the actual water and peace work is happening at a local level, is happening in communities, is happening as people are confronted with the reality that the groundwater table is dropping, that there are actually impacts of conflicts that mean now we have to figure out how to get our water. And if there's nothing happening in terms of peace building, in terms of creating the social cohesion, these can be causes of future tension, especially if you're in a relatively fragile, conflict-affected setting where tensions are already a little bit higher. So there is a lot happening in terms of young people stepping up within their own communities, talking to each other, talking to their elders, making sure that these tensions get resolved before they boil over into yet another escalation of conflict. And then I think as the last point, sort of on the traditional water diplomacy, transboundary cooperation level, something that is very, very important as we're talking about youth inclusion or youth mobilization. It's not actually about youth, and I hope my fellow young colleagues are not going to run me off the stage for this, but we need to stop talking about youth inclusion in these processes, and we need to get back to talking about inclusion, full stop. It's not about young people. Young people are not one big monolith, and if we put one young person or two young people in our processes, then, you know, we tick the box, we're done. That's not how it works. How it works is you figure out who has something valuable to contribute to the conversation, and you figure out what keeps them from making this contribution. And in the case of young people, quite often that is because we are expected to volunteer our time. We're not being paid for the contributions we make. We might get some financial support to go to events, but a lot of times these events are in relatively expensive places. These are places where it might be very difficult to get a visa for, especially if you're still a student in a developing country. And so these are all barriers to youth inclusion, but they're also just barriers to inclusion in general. And so if we're serious about any of these inclusivity topics, we need to tackle them as a whole and stop thinking in silos of women inclusion and youth inclusion, and we have one person here and one person there and one person there, and just start thinking about who needs to be at the table to make this work.
Sure. True. And when we're talking about contribution, then, I mean, this is like to go straight for some of the questions that are here in addition. How does the blue peace integrate and contribute to this? I don't know if any of you have specific questions on that, because I think the blue peace is what brought us all together here. I don't know if anybody wants to take that question.
Sure. Well, look, I can speak for Geneva Water Hub, which is part of the blue peace concept and blue peace movement. And obviously, the idea of first inclusion and then bringing everybody who has something to contribute. Well, that's a really very interesting principle, bringing everybody who has something to contribute. Let us think about an armed conflict which is not at the most intensive phase. There is a degree of freezing of conflict. The conflict is there, but it's not over, but it is kind of semi-frozen. Water is a problem for human consumption, agriculture, energy, everything. There is a line of contact, and there is a problem of line of contact that divides a water basin. And there are people on both sides of the line of contact who would have to find some sort of communication to solve problems. And there are water specialists on both sides of the line of contact who may not be allowed to communicate across the line of contact as freely as they were used to in the past. But they know each other. They know each other, and then they can communicate. Now, that's an example of a practical situation which is happening, and where the blue peace activity can help, because on both sides of contacts they have contacts also with international actors, including the blue peace actors, who can then figure out what might be a way forward, what might work. And sometimes you organize, let's say, a safe space, what we call safe space meeting. People can come discreetly and talk, and then see with their respective authorities or superiors or decision makers how to go about it. And it is quite possible that in time they will develop a form of cooperation which will improve the water situation for civilians on both sides of the line of contact. Now, I would not underestimate the importance of international actors if they are sufficiently sensitive to the local needs. They have to be able to work with local actors in the spirit of inclusiveness. And inclusiveness means everybody who has something to contribute, not inclusiveness in a silo-defined categories, but inclusiveness for everybody who has something to contribute. This is being done and can be expanded. And I think one of the encouraging things about this conference in general, both yesterday and today, is this continued coming back to the need to work with local actors of different kinds. And then, of course, that shows the relevance of such seemingly abstract idea as blue peace or blue peace movement, blue peace concept. Surely it can remain abstract unless it is connected with these real needs in the spirit of inclusiveness, and if it is unable to find ways of working together. The ways can be found, they are being found, and of course what is needed is to nurture them further.
Right.
Because from there you can develop then a meaningful peace-building activity. You don't wait for the conflict to end miraculously. You help ending it by engaging in this sort of peace-building activity from small things to larger things. And then, of course, after a while, I'm sure that it may be possible to work out a more comprehensive peace agreement, and in that case, obviously, water will again be an important part. And we have seen this in peace agreements in history, so we shouldn't be surprised if something like that becomes possible in the future.
Right. Well, thank you for this. I think, we started off this session reflecting and thinking of like how water is weaponized, how it can also be a collateral damage in national circumstances, to how it is also a tool for reconciliation, for cooperation, coming out of very dark periods of time. And we've seen how also the experience of water should be fun. And I think sharing that common experience, that common thread together, is essential to building trust between the partners, to develop that win-win vision around it. At the end of the day, I think the question on IHL was a very important one, because at the end of the day, you need to have that common foundation to meet and to discuss, and to have that inclusion, as we were saying, around local actors. And I think one thing that I've seen in our work is that inclusion and cooperation needs to be meaningful. So breaking the silo means not having youth just for the sake of having youth and ticking the box, or having women in, but it has to be meaningful, and their contribution have to actually participate to the outcome of the discussions, so that women don't walk for kilometers to go and get water, so that water can be trucked or agreed to, and so on. And so I think in many ways, I think this session has brought me, at least me as a moderator, I don't know about people who were in the room, into a more positive and forward-looking mindset to water and peace. And so before we leave, as we have only 5 minutes left, maybe I could ask each one of you, what next? Well, as you leave the room, and for everybody here, what should they think of next for their engagement around this topic? Maybe we can start with you.
I think I keep insisting that all of our approach should be based on human rights and to save the human dignity. Number one. Number two, I think I would say that the water contamination, as you said about the waterborne diseases, or contamination by chemicals, by different factories and everything, will not stay in a one country's boundary. Like cholera from Gaza can spread everywhere. So we have to be clear that it is a collective responsibility of all of us to look at the issues of water and water supplies and access to clean water for everyone. This also includes on the amount of water that every day we spend, like in countries on the sanitation, for example. How much water are used where some of the people in very rich country doesn't have access to clean water.
True.
So again, I insist that there should be human rights-based approach with respect to human dignity. Everybody has the right to live without fear and wants.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know whether you're all aware of that, but the United Nations celebrate yearly the World Water Day, and this year's theme was precisely Water for Peace. So right now, more than 3 billion people worldwide depend on transboundary water resources, and access to sustainable and resilient water supply is so essential, as we've seen today, as we've heard today, that it can be a source of conflict or means of peace alike in all current or future geopolitical challenges, which will surely be increased due to climate change consequences. And I believe that intact aquatic ecosystems safeguard water resources and thus contribute to conflict prevention and grant peace and stability. And transboundary river commissions such as the ICPR can be an important motor to strengthen ties between different actors and interests to create a win-win situation for all in the long run. And in this sense, a Sustainable Development Goal number 6 in 6.5 rightfully calls for the implementation of integrated water resources management at all levels, including through transboundary cooperation by 2030. And finally, #water in all policies.
Thank you. Julian, last words?
I think I would join Dr. Sommer in just highlighting the human component of this. We talked about as water is life. We say it so often, it almost loses meaning, but it really is the most human need, and it connects us all, and I think we can leverage that a lot more. There was a question on what can we do here with our clean tap water. Hold your leaders accountable. Hold your leaders accountable to how they behave on an international stage towards countries that might not respect the right to water as much as you would like them to.
Thank you.
And as one little homework for the lunch break, talk to a young person, you might learn something new.
Great. Thank you, Julian. I give you the last words.
Yeah. Well, we must understand that the world is now in a particularly dangerous situation. Wars have proliferated. This is the time of 55 active armed conflicts in practically all parts of the world, or most parts of the world. Now, for that reason, I think the priority should be water as an instrument of peace. Water should be protected in times of active armed conflict, and water should be used from the first moment of when this becomes possible as an instrument of peace building. So I think in the time of proliferation of armed conflicts, this sort of priorities have to be very clearly there, and from there, all other forms of developing water as an instrument of peace will flow.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your contribution. Thank you.
Okay.
Right on time.